Thank you so much for joining me today to kick off this incredible conversation with the Right Honourable David Johnston, 28th Governor General of Canada and Chair of the Rideau Hall Foundation, and of course, Dr. Megan Conway, President and CEO of Volunteer Canada. Welcome to you both.
Good to see you, Sam.
Thanks,
We're
Sam.
going to start off with some great questions today, and then we're going to turn it over to our audience for some interactive Q&A by working a session that will be divided into breakout sessions to discuss some of those key questions around empathy and building a roadmap for a more empathetic Canada. So let's get started. David and Megan, we've got some great questions for you today. Let's start off with you, Mr. Johnston. How would you define empathy?
Well, call me David, Sam. Empathy is walking in the other person's shoes. It's not sympathy. Sympathy is I feel sorry for you. But with any luck, that sense of identification with the other person leads to compassion. And compassion, feeling that discomfort of the other person, leads to empathy. And empathy is an active verb. It means roll up your sleeves, walking in the other person's shoes and doing something about it. And it's really that action that I think is quite key with empathy. It's walking the second mountain. There's a lovely book by David Brooks, the editorialist for the New York Times, called The Second Mountain. And he describes the first mountain as those high achievers who are climbing up the mountain and achieving particular status or records or promotions or that sort of thing and awards. And they have a sense of satisfaction of this upward journey, and in fact, perhaps a sense of happiness as well. And they're admired by their peers. He says, though, if you're really lucky as you're climbing that first mountain, you look across the valley and you see a second mountain, and here are other people climbing up, and some not climbing up quite as successfully or as rapidly and stumbling back. And if you are lucky, you cross that valley and you walk that second mountain with those other people and give them a hand up that mountain so their journey becomes better. And he says what originally was satisfaction or even happiness on the first mountain becomes joy on the second mountain, the joy of seeing others succeed and helping them succeed.
Oh, beautifully said. Thank you so much. And Megan, can I ask you if you can define empathy for me? How would you define it?
Well, I loved what Mr. Johnston had to say there. I think it was a very beautiful metaphor of what it's like to experience empathy. And I think about myself and my own experience of practicing empathy. And I want to underline the fact that I think empathy is really something that's a road we have to travel on all the time. It's a journey. It's not necessarily a destination that we arrive at. I also believe that the notion of compassion, of really seeing that other person for the position that they're in and seeing them for what they're experiencing, is what it is to really feel and experience empathy. But empathy on its own, I think, can become stuck. It can become a little bit limited. And I think when we start to put our empathy into action, when we actually move outside of ourselves to do something about what it is we're observing or what we're feeling or noticing, then that's when we actually start to provide service to others and service to the planet or to our community or to those around us. I also believe firmly that empathy is often experienced when we don't have empathy or when we don't feel it. I sometimes notice myself, if I'm feeling grumbly or frustrated, reflecting and noticing, hey, wait a second, there's another choice I have here around how I respond or how I might react. And those are the times that I think are opportunities for us to make more empathetic choices around how we want to move forward in our day-to-day lives.
Mm-hmm. Beautifully said. Thank you so much, Megan. And
Sam, I just add to that with another observation about the individual, particularly when Megan so wisely describes it as a journey with steps forward and sometimes steps back. But in speaking to young people, I talk about the movement from the first person singular to the first person plural, from me to we, from the I to the collectivity. And so, if your life centers around you as the center of the universe, it can get a little bit lonely. And if you are lucky and cross to that second mountain, if you are able to begin to think of the other people and how you associate with other people to improve their situation, a huge load drops off your shoulders. You're no longer possessed with what this means to you, but you're very identified with what your actions mean to the other person. And that weight dropping off your shoulders is a wonderful liberation feeling of moving from me to we.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, David. And, I was thinking about everything that's going on in the world right now. I mean, it has been such a challenging time, continues to be globally a challenging time. I'd love for you to talk, David, about the relationship between empathy and trust.
Well, I think at the heart of empathy and trust is a notion of fairness. And in this country, especially equality of opportunity. And of course, as we see the tremendous challenges we face in this world today, this barbaric war of Russia against Ukraine, for example, how totally unfair, how totally unjust that is, how cruel it is, and the other challenges that face us in so many directions, COVID having swept across the world and done so much damage, etc. And I think that if COVID has taught us anything, it's our mutual vulnerability, that we really are our brother or sister's keeper, and must be if we are going to be able to deal with that pandemic and others. Climate change is another example of that, where we are mutually together and mutually vulnerable. So empathy, I think, is essential just to deal with conflict and challenge in the world and to succeed on this planet Earth. It's also simply the right thing to do. If you have a society where empathy is strong, where volunteerism is strong, it's a healthy society. I often gauge the health of a community by the per capita volunteers in that community. If it's higher than the norm, that community tends to be pretty healthy and pretty successful. And if it's below the norm and falling, that community is in a downward spiral. Empathy does lead to trust, and trust is simply recognizing that you can depend upon others to do the right thing, to do the fair thing. And trust is the glue and the grease of our society. It's the glue that holds things together, and it's the grease that makes things less frictional, less easier to accomplish, to move more slowly. That wonderful U.S. statesman, George Shultz, who died just a few months ago at age 99, once said, trust is the coin of the realm. When you have trust in a room, whether it's the boardroom or the operations room or the training room or the military room or the family room, everything goes well. When you don't, they don't. Everything else is detailed. And I think that's so true about the functioning of a society. So we wrote a book on trust that came out about 2 years ago. And what motivated us to write it was during the 7 years we spent at Rideau Hall, I became increasingly concerned about the diminution of trust in public institutions, how we govern ourselves, and the diminution of fairness and equality of opportunity. And so we began to write about how do you have a trustworthy nation, a trustworthy country. We realized that that was built upon trustworthy communities, trustworthy local institutions, neighborhoods, enterprises, and so on. And where did they come from? They come from trustworthy individuals. And so we changed the arc of the book and began with how do each of us become and be trustworthy individuals, and then transfer that to the businesses in which we're involved, the community associations, neighborhoods, families, and so on. And then how do we build that up to an entire society? And the old saying applies, that trust comes in on foot and goes out on horseback, or as my great friend Mark Carney says, to make it more modern, trust comes in on foot and goes out in a Ferrari. And I think that's a great challenge for us in this very blessed country, Canada, to be standard setters in trust being a fundamental value that permeates each of us as individuals, but our associations and in our nation itself.
Setters. I'm gonna steal that one, David. I like that a lot. That's great.
Yeah, the other thing I'd say about that, Sam, is trust and empathy are two sides of the same coin. Mm-hmm. They exist together, but in the middle of that coin is hope. And, for people to be able to engage and indeed to practice empathy themselves, they need to have hope in their own souls and be prepared to create that sense of hope in others, that things will be better and we will do it together to make them better. Trust, empathy, the coin, and then hope emerging as the kind of motivating factor.
Oh, I love that. Thank you so much, David, for that. And, you know, Megan, I can't help but sort of think about hope right now as such a, you know, like we said earlier, it's such a challenging time in our lives. I'd love you to know love you to tell us what you know about the barriers to empathy.
Well, thanks, Sam. And I really appreciated Mr. Johnston's reflections on that quality of hope that can often feel elusive, or that's maybe out of reach. But I totally love how he describes hope being the thing that connects trust and empathy, and how that having hope in oneself is the first step, really, to believing that you can make a change in what's happening around you. When I reflect on some of the barriers, I'm really mindful of what my own life has been like over the last 2 years. And I say that as I come from a place of privilege. I was able to work safely at home throughout the pandemic. I was able to put in place precautions for myself and my family. I'm a white middle-class woman. And so I feel this sense of a recognition that there have been increased challenges potentially, or maybe the perception of challenges that have emerged over the last couple of years throughout the pandemic. We've in some ways been a little more disconnected from one another. We have not been able to be out and in community in the same kinds of ways that we might have been in the past. We haven't been able to see people who are experiencing a range of different experiences in community. And I think that inability to maybe connect with those of us that are not exactly like us in the same kinds of ways could potentially be a barrier. I also think there's a really important journey that we're hopefully walking on right now as it relates to reconciliation with our with Indigenous peoples across Canada, and really learning from them around what we need to do to really acknowledge how to bring our different peoples together. I also think that, you know, Black, Indigenous, and people of color are hopefully taking the lead, and that white people who are holding power are able to follow and support creating more connected and more inclusive and just paths toward communities that are places where everyone really can belong in the truest sense of the word. You know, I really appreciated what Mr. Johnston said around the fact that indices of connection and indices of participation are really how we should be measuring the health of a community. And before the pandemic, 24 million Canadians gave back either formally or informally in a variety of different ways. And so I think we need to look at what are the ways that all Canadians can participate in giving back through volunteering or through informal volunteering, through caregiving, and through activism and engagement in their local communities. I think Canadians want to help, and they want to find the ways to help. And I think part of our job, or part of my job, is looking at what are the barriers that exist that prevent people from being able to easily give back of their time and their talent and their energy. So I think those are some of the things I think about in terms of what the barriers are. And some of them, I think, Sam, are self-imposed. I think sometimes if we spend too much time alone, as Mr. Johnston said, we start to think, well, what can I do? Or what hope can I have in making a difference? And I think part of it is starting with something small and being able to just step into some small action, or even just the act of curiosity of reflecting on, how might this problem look different, or how might this problem be different through my own participation in trying to solve it. I think those are a few things that I've thought about or reflected upon. And I think that some barriers exist in different sectors, in different ways, that I think as leaders, we all have a choice and the chance to try to address in a variety of different ways.
Absolutely. And I think, Megan, you touched on something that's really important, that connection to community, right? If you don't feel connected, to others or to community, it can be a bit challenging. What's kind of coming to my mind, a visual is, how does a mouse eat an elephant? It's one bite at a time. It's that first step. Would you agree, Megan?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think even myself, I noticed throughout the pandemic, I was becoming much more in my head. I wasn't out in the world as much. And I think that really presents a risk about holding us back from knowing where to start. And I think, or I believe firmly that there are so many small ways to start in terms of how we improve our communities and how we improve the quality of life for our neighbors. And also just the willingness to recognize the social situation, or the circumstances of what's happening in our communities. I think the ability to pay attention and to observe and to reflect on what's happening is a critical skill for us as we move forward and think about how we might connect with people who are very different than us or who might hold very different values than us, for sure.
Sam,
David,
can
do you
I
have
just
anything
comment
to
on
add?
barriers? Yeah, I'd like to comment on barriers as well. The Rideau Hall Foundation, which I chair and which we set up in 2012 when I was at Rideau Hall to amplify the reach of the Office of the Governor General. We were very interested in how youth see volunteerism and empathy. And we conducted a study with Abacus and got the results in the past year. And the findings were, number one, youth are very interested in volunteerism, and many have already crossed that from that first mountain to the second mountain. But the barriers for them are, one, not seeing the opportunities that they can identify with themselves. They often identify volunteer institutions and so on as kind of older people and from the past, etc. And very often they have kind of practical barriers. One is the information about. Two is very often the cost of being involved. It might be something as simple as bus fare, etc. Another thing is that they define community in a different way. It's not so much a place, a geographical situation, or a house or a church, but it's rather a social community, very often social media, identification with a group of peers that come through those kinds of interactions. And that's a different way for us to think about volunteerism than we have in the past. Less institutionalized, more fluid activity that is meaningful to them on their own terms and in their own way. And I think that adjustment is pretty important if we want to encourage youth to be involved in more volunteerism and to use that kind of new perception of the world of young people. And it has such ripple effects that you referred to, Megan. I'm fond of quoting Queen Elizabeth, especially her Christmas messages, where she, in her faith, often refers to stories that reinforce those values of love thy neighbor. And in one of her last ones, she referred to volunteer acts of kindness. Actually, she was using the Good Samaritan parable to illustrate this of loving thy neighbor, even when thy neighbor is quite different than you. She said those acts are like dropping a pebble into a pond. They create a ripple, but that ripple extends right across the pond. And that's what happens, I think, with these acts of volunteerism and acts of kindness and the recognition of volunteers. It has a ripple effect. It causes a current through the whole pond. And I think that's what we're attempting to do, especially in National Volunteer Week, to recognize the ripple effect of volunteerism and that selfless instinct of helping others, spreading across the country in a very benevolent way.
Yeah, wonderfully said, David.
I love what you said there, Mr. Johnston, especially because I think it speaks to the ways that we can find opportunities to be in community and in connection with other people who we might otherwise find ways of separating from. I love those messages. And the other thing I loved about what you just said there was, I believe firmly that we have so much to learn from those in our community and those in our country who are different from us, whether it be a young person who lives in Regent Park, for instance, or someone who's Indigenous, or someone who is, a Black philanthropist, in Halifax. I believe firmly that we have so much to learn from different community members who have experienced life differently and for whom have lessons to teach me, especially as I think about service. I think there's much wisdom in other perspectives as it pertains to community and how we might give back.
Megan, let me give a good example. Yesterday I was on a Zoom call with a program run at the Rotman School of Business at the University of Toronto. It's David Beattie is the director of this program. And they have a course for directors, which is really renowned, and I think do a better job on the notion of governance than any other institution I know in the world. And the director's course is a flagship. Well, David, when he learned about the Black North Initiative, phoned Wes Hall, who's been the driving force, and said, look, we would be glad to organize a series of weekend seminars so that there'd be kind of a mini director's course for people that you identify in the Black North Initiative who are ready to go on boards of directors, but have not had the door opened. And so I was speaking at their last weekend event, completing the course. And it was really so enervating to see these people who are talented, but just needed the door opening. And, thank heavens that here the Rotman School and David Beatty's initiative just did this pro bono to give these people a leg up. And one of the initiatives that we undertaken at the Rito Hall Foundation, which I'm really excited about, is an initiative in partnership with the MasterCard Foundation to provide educational opportunities for 10,000 Indigenous youth over the next 10 years to become teachers, to build the capacity in education, to see education as the new buffalo for Indigenous people. And it operates on the principle of nothing about us without us. This program will be driven by Indigenous people, Indigenous associations, in partnerships with local faculties of education. And they will identify young Indigenous people as early as age 15 or 16, the last couple of years of high school, and giving them opportunities at being camp counselors, assistance in early childhood, etc. And then on into university, where they'll do a B.Ed degree, but it will be shaped by the Indigenous studies within that particular faculty of education, so that these young people are able to learn more about their own culture and their own way of thinking and bring that into their professional training, and develop the mentors and the peer groups and the other opportunities to grow as teachers. And over a period of 10 years, I think I would believe that we can eliminate that education gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people by building that kind of capacity and seeing teaching as a noble profession. In my installation address, Smart and Caring Nation, call to service, I said, if you remember only 3 words of what I say today, they are cherish our teachers, cherish our teachers. Because apart from our parents, our family, they have the most influence on us. And I said, if we had 3 hours together in the Senate chambers, I'd tell you 100 stories of mentors, counselors, teachers that have made a difference in my life. So to me, that's really empathetic in the right sense, but it's nothing about us without us. It'll be driven by Indigenous people with their particular cultural distinctiveness in regions across the country. It won't succeed if it's a nationally driven program prescribing what should happen. We've tried all those and they failed. But this will be driven by the Indigenous communities themselves, and then developing the pedagogical tools, and then becoming the teachers that really strengthen those communities to see education as a great step up.
What I love about that also is that it's not a nationally driven initiative. It's coming from Indigenous communities and Indigenous leaders themselves. At Volunteer Canada, one of the things that I've become aware of is that there actually, in many Indigenous languages, there isn't a word for volunteering, and yet we know Indigenous people give back in many, many different ways. And so at Volunteer Canada, I'm also very interested in how we need new narratives and new frameworks or models to think about the diverse ways that Canadians are giving back, so that they can be more culturally relevant and rooted in various communities across Canada.
Thank you so much. I want to ask this question. Megan, how would you assess the current state of empathy in Canada?
Well, that's a great question, Sam. I think the pandemic has presented a number of challenges for community organizations specifically in terms of their capacity to re-engage volunteers as we think about moving out of the pandemic. As I mentioned, approximately 5 out of 6 Canadians give back either formally or informally. And yet we know that for the social recovery in Canada to take hold, we really need to think about reinvesting in Canada's volunteering infrastructure. We need to make sure that there are friendly staff at organizations who are capable to receive volunteers and able to support them in getting engaged and learning about the organizations that volunteers want to give back in. I think that that kind of investment happening nationally would support volunteer-led organizations to have the kinds of resources and capacities they really need to move forward into the future. I think sometimes our thinking about empathy in action or models of volunteering relies heavily on goodwill. And I think while goodwill is one thing, I also think we need to be thinking about the kinds of structural investments that need to be made to really ensure that we have the kinds of volunteering supports across Canada that will ensure we have models for volunteering for the future, not just for today.
And David, do you have anything to add?
Well, I think by nature, Canada is a volunteer and empathetic country, beginning with our First Nations people who have learned how to live on a very challenging geography. Canada's been a cold country, etc., and they've learned well. But I think of our history. There's so many instances where we have examples of empathy and volunteerism making the nation work. Champlain's first settlement, Port Royal in Nova Scotia, would not have survived the first winter had the local Indigenous tribe not provided fresh meat and actually a tea that was made from evergreen needles, which today we understand had vitamin C to prevent scurvy. Just one example of the people already here reaching to these new immigrants to help them survive in this country. And that's been a really important theme, I think, through how this country, Canada, has developed. When we were in Waterloo, Megan, you did your doctorate at the University of Waterloo, and you would know that the volunteer strengths of that community. We had an award called the Barn Raising Award, individuals who really developed the community. I see evidence of that all across the country. And I think what we have to do is celebrate those and connect those, especially at a time when you say, Megan, there's been a tendency to kind of close the wagons. And COVID, climate change, the disputes breaking out around the world, and a kind of diminution of the Western rule of law order that has prevailed since World War II, eroding, etc. And I think we have to overcome that inward-looking nature and look outward and celebrate these examples that I referred to and be like that pebble in the pond to cause it to spread and that to become the prevailing sort of wave that permeates our community and encourages people to simply regard the other and do something about it.
Well, I have learned a lot from you today, and I know our audience has lots of questions. We're going to turn it over to our audience for questions now for David Johnston and Megan Conway.